Very good. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I love this event. I'm looking forward to this quite a bit. But I just want to give a brief hello to everyone that made a choice to come here to hear these wonderful voices. This event is being sponsored not by only the Extreme Events Institute, but also by the Mellon Grant, specifically the Mellon Grant that's about local to global, building a commons for justice. And for those of you that are not aware, this grant in itself that was awarded to us by Mellon, it was all about identifying, illustrating, and addressing racial, ethnic inequities when it comes to pre as well as post-event disasters and building resource capacities. But I also want to acknowledge that we really are about community resilience. And to be able to promote community resilience, we came at it from approach of a collaboratory approach. And the collaboratory approach for us meant co-identification, co-design, and co-production. To be able to have that happen, though, we needed to look at everyone as experts. That meant looking at not just bringing in practitioners and academics, but it meant bringing in community members, as well as faculty and students. Our goal here was not just for a multiplicity of voices, but also intergenerational. So we are looking forward to a wonderful conversation today with these wonderful panelists, and we hope you enjoy it as well. Thank you. And I'll take a moment now to turn over to my fellow colleague, Dr. Mitzi Carter.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Mitzi Uehara Carter. I am a professor at FIU, and I'm also the director of the Global Indigenous Forum. I often get asked to do land acknowledgements before opening some events. And to be honest, in the past year or so, I've been feeling slightly uncomfortable given the context of our current political landscape. And so, because I started to feel like maybe they were feeling like a little inert or like a checkbox activity type of thing to do. And so, but then I went this summer to my mother's homeland of the Ryukyu Islands, and she's Uchinanchu. Our family are indigenous folk of southern Japan. And one of the things that we do there, the very first thing that we do when we arrive is to go to where the bones of our clan's ancestors are gathered. We offer gifts, we greet the spirits, we pay homage to the land. And then my uncle always takes me right to the military fence line, and we can see right through it, and we can see the big do not enter signs. And through that fence, he points to the land on which he and my mom grew up on, the place they can no longer access or farm because it's behind that security fence. It's a land from which they were forcibly displaced. And many Okinawans were moved from these lands and placed on non-arable areas. And theirs is a history of multiple displacements, as is the case for so many indigenous people around the world. That ritual of visiting the fence line and looking at that land, not as a lost possession, but more as a lament that it's now a place that's not cared for in the same way. All the trees were shorn from it. The hills were cut down to make landing pads. And I realize now it's something he does ritualistically because he wants me to understand that that is a land that's land that remembers, and that they remember too. And they know it well. There are strong memories of how it was cared for, of how the mangroves protected them from the typhoons, that the hills provided wind protection. They knew the physics of the winds and could engineer their minimalist, airy homes so that the winds would not destroy them. Their spirits that they pray to are infused in those spaces. And it made me realize in that moment this summer that paying homage to the original stewards of the land is not cliche. It just has to be done with heart. And it can be a potent act of respect and a declaration that we are still here. So folks, here are the facts. The original stewards of these lands that we now know as South Florida are Miccosukee tribe of Florida, the Seminole tribe, and before the Tequesta and the Calusa. So the people leading this panel today are important members of the Miccosukee tribe. We're working closely with them, and they too have held a strong relationship to this land. For generations upon generations, Miccosukee have cared for the tree islands, for the rivers, for the animals that rely on healthy ecosystems and the lands of the Everglades and beyond. They've absorbed stories about these spaces. Their knowledge of disaster is rich. Their knowledge of changing risk and how water should flow, or how water flows or should flow, is incredibly deep. Betty Osceola who's one of the panelists here today, has taught me that it's urgent to listen to Miccosukee voices and frameworks that position solutions differently. When you hear the conversation about Indigenous concepts of healing instead of frameworks of fixing, you'll realize how different that is, how they're more dynamic and innovative. Just 2 days ago was Indigenous Peoples Day and Miccosukee Peoples Day, or Miccosukee Day, which is a day set aside to get us all to stop and critically reflect on policies that have attempted to eradicate or displace Native people throughout the Americas. But it's also a day to reflect on all the diverse forms of Indigenous radical resilience, acts of authentic reconciliation, and moments of peaceful transactions. So instead of the typical land acknowledgement, I want to ask all of you who signed on today, and there's many of you here today, to listen to each other, to all of the speakers here, with that full intent of Indigenous Peoples Day. And I hope that you make a goal to get involved with healing the Everglades in alliance with Indigenous people. So now I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator for this panel, Reverend Houston R. Cypress, who is a two-spirit artist, a poet, activist from the Otter Clan of the Miccosukee tribe. Houston has been a constant environmental advocate, using his art practice to educate and inspire action. He's a co-founder of the phenomenal organization Love the Everglades. Please follow them on IG right now if you can. They have a wonderful page. Houston has held artist residencies at multiple places, including the Musagatis Foundation. I probably messed that up. And Ulite Arts. I can go on and on about Houston, but I will pass the mic on to him to introduce the rest of our panel. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter and Ms. Washington, very much for the opportunity to be of service today. It's an honor to be with you. Today's topic is Voices of the Everglades, Indigenous Knowledge and Stewardship. And we have a very esteemed and well-respected panelists here today that I would like to take some time to introduce to you. First of all, I would like to introduce our Secretary for the Miccosukee Business Council, a gentleman known as Popeye, also known as William Osceola. And Mr. Osceola has been serving the Business Council in the community for a number of years, but he also has a very beautiful artistic practice in the visual arts. And I highly recommend that you learn more about his work there as well, because it is advancing the visual identity and the visual culture of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. Next, I'd like to introduce one of our esteemed colleagues, Ms. Betty Osceola. Ms. Betty Osceola is from the Panther Clan, and she is an Everglades educator, as well as a business owner and a person who is creating a variety of content in multimedia for people of all ages to enjoy and to deepen their connection to the natural world. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Edward Ornstein, Esquire, serving as the Deputy General Counsel for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. And Mr. Ornstein is also a member of the Southeastern Muskogee Nation of Alabama, and recently was awarded a recognition by the Miccosukee Arts and Science Symposium for his service to the tribe and for his connection to the Miccosukee community. I also want to say thank you and welcome for joining us today to Mr. Kevin Caniff. Mr. Kevin Caniff is serving as the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida and has many decades of service on behalf of the environment. And so it is my honor to welcome all of the panelists here today. Thank you for joining us. As we get started, I want to let everybody know that the topics of today's conversation include a deep insight on the Miccosukee tribe's history and culture. We're going to take some time to discuss how cultural perspectives are influencing the restoration work with regards to water and hydrology issues throughout the greater Everglades. But to be more specific, I think it's more appropriate to talk about the healing work that this is really concerned with, because this is about how we're looking at this work from multiple perspectives, from the Miccosukee perspective and from American or Western perspectives as well. We're also going to discuss the implications for climate risk and resilience. And, we do have a lot of important things to share, a lot of important perspectives to offer, but this is a conversation. So we welcome you, friends, family, and future friends, to think deeply about what kind of questions that you would like to offer as a part of this conversation. We welcome you. We want to hear what you have to say and what you are interested and curious about. We find that a lot of the best topics of conversation come out in the question and answer period. So please be ready and please be prepared to contribute to the conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. So I think we're going to go ahead and just jump right into the conversation and start with a deep dive by looking at the what folks are calling indigenous traditional ecological knowledge these days. In an academic perspective, there's researchers such as Frickwood Berkes, who back in 2000 defined traditional ecological knowledge as a cumulative body of knowledge, belief, and practice, which is evolving by accumulation and which is passed down through generations through forms of traditional songs, traditional stories, and beliefs. And so again, this is about our relationships with the environment. But this is just one way of looking at things, and we do want to open it up to looking at it from an indigenous perspective. What do the community, what do the folks themselves have to say on this topic? So I wanted to check in with our friends, Ms. Betty Osceola and Mr. William Osceola, to see what their perspectives are. And maybe Ms. Betty, we'll start with you, ladies first, right? So I wanted to ask you, because you have a unique experience that not a lot of young people have these days, or maybe folks that grew up differently don't have the same kind of experiences that you might have grown up with. So I wanted to ask you, Ms. Betty, what are some personal experiences from your life, or maybe stories or knowledge that you've received that's important for you, that helps you have a relationship with the natural world? Like, what does this mean for you? And how do these stories and how does this knowledge help you in your work in caring for the earth and for the Everglades?
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for myself that I'm very fortunate and blessed to have grown up in a time where we were still living off the landscape. And in my early childhood, the food that made it to the table was what we harvested from the landscape or what my mother was able to grow. And we had my grandmother living with us. So we had that generational experiences from my mother and also my grandmother and our visiting uncles. And in my early childhood, I always was always excited for the time in the evenings, the early evenings, because that's when the storytelling time, and my grandmother would tell stories about how the Florida was in her time. And and even my mother, she would talk about how the animals were plentiful. And when I would ask about the birds, because I always thought I saw a lot of birds as a kid, but hearing from my grandmother and my mom that what I was seeing it wasn't half of what my mom was seeing. And what my mother saw in her childhood was even less than what my grandmother saw. And having to live off the landscape and going with my grandmother, walking out into, we grew up more in the Cypress part of the Everglades, which is now known as the Big Cypress National Preserve, but walking out of our Indian village and looking for different fruits that grow in the swamp, and even trying to look for turtles, look for fish. My grandmother really taught me about the importance of knowing the seasons, when things grow, when water is ideal for certain wildlife. And really at an early childhood, we were taught that that's the time that you have to learn these things, because that's when you remember the best and you're like a sponge. And even, my mother teaching us, also teaching us what is edible or not, and building our structures. And they always talked about how we had to have a healthy environment for those things to thrive, because when they thrive, we thrive. And having that experience in the growing up, because I'm of the last generation that had some form of subsistence living in their life. And then as I got older and the environment of Florida started changing and the water quality started changing, that's when our diet started changing. And to me, you know, indigenous knowledge is a lifelong learning. And it's the knowledge that our ancestors saw of the landscape. Because you have to remember, before TV, they had to be able to tell the weather, forecast the weather, looking at the clouds, looking at what the animals did, and even the colors of the sky, and also the constellations, knowing where they were set, kind of and even the position of the moon. Like today, I periodically look at the moon and the position of where the moon should be to have a healthy environment. You have to know that as well. And when I look at the moon today, when I glance up into the sky, the moon has shifted. And I remember one of my uncles saying, when you see the moon shift counterclockwise a little bit towards the north in the sky, when you have that little sliver of that new moon, that means the earth is off balance. And we have to work. And he pointed that out not too recently, and he wasn't liking where the position of that night moon was. And when it's in that crescent phase of the new moon. And I look, and I think about that in an account I was reading about the Inuits and how they're expressing their concern, because when you live towards the Arctic, you have to know the weather and you have to be able to forecast it for hunting survival. And they're seeing the same thing that my uncle is seeing, how the earth has shifted a little bit. So that all plays into understanding the environment and having that knowledge, but not watching TV, not looking at some computer model, but actually the nature itself telling you what things are doing. And that really brought me back during this recent hurricane that passed by Milton, and seeing what the birds were doing, seeing what the wildlife was doing, seeing what the colors of that sky was showing if that hurricane was going to come our way or not. If it was going to be, fortunately, we had some birds still around. So I'm like, okay, the hurricane's going to come by, but not all the birds deserted the Everglades. So we're going to be okay. Because if you see 0 birds, then you're in trouble. And so I'm like, okay, it's going to come, but it's going to, okay, because some of the birds are still hanging out here. And those are things that you learn through your experiences. And I think it's, for us, you know, it's very important that we continue to understand that knowledge and understand what nature is trying to tell you, and really delve into that. Because if nature is thriving, we as the human species, the animals that we are going to thrive. And always our people always come from a place of healing, because, you know, we're inherently healers. We're taught to be healers, and we're taught to coexist with our relatives. And to me, I think that's a very hard concept to get other people to understand, that plants and animals have feelings, just as we do. But we need to honor their feelings as well. And they communicate with us when they're thriving, and they communicate with us when they're not feeling well. And we need to listen to those messages and come from a place of healing, especially when we look at Everglades restoration. How can we heal the environment? And which is what the tribe is trying to do, is to heal that environment so our landscapes can thrive. And I'm happy that, you know, as a tribe, that we're really, you know, tackling it heads on and delving into how can we do that with our knowledge, but also incorporating the Western knowledge and science to come for a better outcome, not just for the Miccosukee, but for all of us that live here in South Florida and the world, actually, because the Everglades are the kidneys of the world. I'll stop there.
Mado, thank you, Betty. And I'm curious, I wanted to hear, I'll ask the same question for our colleague, Secretary Osceola. What are some personal experiences or maybe knowledge that you've received in your life that has been helpful for you in your work with the tribe maybe advancing the tribe interests or protecting the environment?
So I do want to touch on a couple of things. I'm just quickly going back to the land acknowledgement. I used to feel previously like because of all the work we've done and everything that we're exposed to as tribal members, like, yeah, it didn't feel like enough. But I have to contextualize it with the folks outside of my vicinity. Like most people don't have an understanding of, you know, what Indigenous people have gone through or even who the Indigenous people of that land were or are. And I think it is important actually to do land acknowledgements, especially because unfortunately history tends to repeat itself. In the past, sometimes you had tribes trying to undercut other tribes, and unfortunately that's still issues that some tribes like ourselves have to deal with today. Other entities out there trying to undercut our sovereignty, which undercuts our very experience and our existence, because our experience and existence as Miccosukee tribal members has been shaped by our connection to this land that we are currently in now. Everything we do out here is geared towards protecting that so that way our people have a place to live in the future. So I just wanted to kind of touch base on that with the land acknowledgement, because previously I felt a little bit differently about it, but I do think it's important to remind folks who actually had ties to this land so others don't come in and misrepresent that history. Because there are people out there who are trying to do good work and try to be more understanding, and unfortunately sometimes they are led astray. So with that being said, I just want to say again, Shinabashat for hosting us from one of Florida's 2 tribes. Proud to be Miccosukee. That's why we have Miccosukee Day. And one of the things that really helped me get connected when I was younger, you know, I do want to mention, I know Miss Betty still has her camp. She still maintains it, still stays there. I don't have a camp, but I was able to spend some time as a kid living at my grandma Peggy's camp. So that experience has still stayed strong in my mind because in the camp, you got the rest of the family around you. So, you know, you wake up in the morning, you go outside, you just play with your cousins, your uncles and aunts and stuff are around. And then you just have nature to enjoy and experience and to live in, to just thrive. And, you know, in the camp, we have rules based off of our experience here with the land. So that way we can stay safe, especially if you got kids running around. You want them to be safe. So you want them to understand the land. But that understanding and the rules, that gives us a sense of safety and it allows us to be free and allows us to be ourselves. And again, that is all based off of the work and everything that the land has done for us. And I think about that because even now to this day, sometimes I still try to like take a moment to just stop and look at the trees. Like if you ever look at the leaves and the way all the shadows dance against each other and how the light kind of comes through them when you're looking from the bottom up. It's such a simple thing, the wind blowing through the leaves, but then you see all of this complex interaction. And I think that just is true about the world in general. Everything is much more simple than it is, but our interactions make it more complex to get done what needs to be done. And I think everybody just needs to realize like you do have to take a second to just detach and go outside, like get a fresh breath of air. And environments like the Everglades provide that. You go to Miami, you take a deep breath, you don't get clean air. And that oxygen is filling your heart, filling your lungs, filling your brain. So you just got to think about what's coming inside you with that type of chemicals. So it's important, again, that we keep these type of environments preserved as best as we can. Our whole objective is to get it closer back to what nature had already intended. You know, I've gotten in the habit of telling people, I think the problem with human nature is it's humans putting themselves before nature when we are from nature, of nature, and one day we'll return to nature. So I try to keep that stuff in mind. And I do think a lot of that goes back to getting connected and feeling connected with the land at a young age. You know, when you can just get up and go swim in the canal with your cousins, it's just right there, accessible. That's like you just feel alive. You just feel connected. You're connected with your people, connected with the land. I do have to shout out to my grandmother, Peggy, because she's honestly been the most positive person I know. And she's lived in that camp her whole life. She's in her late 90s, almost 100. The fact that she has had that outlook, considering everything she's been through, and that she's still with us, despite the fact that she's almost a century-year old. I think right there, that's all the evidence you need of the power of the land and staying connected to it and realizing that you are a piece of it and you are not in control of it. I think that's often the issue we have to deal with is people not accepting that they don't have control over the situation like they want. I mean, we had these hurricanes come through. Just it's a nice reminder we're not in charge like we like to think we are. And because of our history out here, we have seen the changes. Those storms, yes, historically there have been like crazy storms that happen, but they're happening at a more frequent rate. And we see that out here as well with the flooding. the increases in that, and that has a big devastation on the ecological habitation of the animals here. If you come around during hurricane season, you're going to see a lot more turtles on the road that have been run over because the tree islands have been flooded, so they can't stay there. So right there, you're exacerbating a population that's already under attack from whether it's chemical runoff, invasive species, and now all of this out of control flooding. So yeah, a lot of the work we do is just trying to get things back to what nature had intended, because we've seen firsthand that's what works.
Thank you, Secretary Osceola. So I'm reflecting on the things that Betty and William have offered, and just in that short period of time, they're telling us that the traditional ecological knowledge that they have has been really useful in identifying how vibrant or how numerous species populations used to be. Betty was talking about seeing the loss of animals over generational time periods. And she's also talking about being able to live off the land at one point. And Mr. Osceola is also reminding us that these kind of perspectives support a philosophy, support a perspective, a way of life that is different from other folks. Other folks might think of this way of life as maybe a little bit disorienting, maybe a little bit strange or hard to fathom. And so I think I'm curious to see like how acceptable or how willing is American culture and American society, how willing are they to accept these kind of knowledges and these kind of testimonies and these kind of anecdotes. And I wanted to check in maybe with our friend, Mr. Edward Ornstein, who might have some insight on how willing is the broader society to consider this kind of knowledge when doing the work of conservation or just diplomacy in general. I wanted to check in with Mr. Ornstein on that.
Thank you, Houston. I think we can say that America is about as willing to consider indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in their rulemaking as they are to not taking indigenous land. You know, like there's pieces that they'll take. There's pieces of indigenous traditional ecological knowledge they'll acknowledge, but by and large, what we've heard so far is something that I think in and of itself, federal rulemakers won't consider. They actually have promulgated really, really specific guidance from the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy and the Council for Environmental Quality in the White House. And they made like 15 different conditions that ITech has to meet in order for it to be used for federal rulemaking, for decision making in the federal government. It has to be tied to a specific location, must be substantiated as part of a relationship across generations. Theory, scope, approach, methods, and context must be clearly described. The information is understood and applied in a way that's respectful and consistent with cultural, spiritual, and environmental context. The knowledge used or applied is applied in an objective, unbiased manner, while retaining the inherent use and value of the information and lived experience of the knowledge holders, preserving the language and names within the information, considering that information from an indigenous lens, but weaving it together with Western knowledge. There must be free, prior, and informed consent granted for the use of the information. But in the case of any information gathered in a federally recognized tribal community, that consent must come from the tribal leadership. And that knowledge must exclude culturally sensitive information subject to FOIA requests. The author of the document has to make clear how the information will be protected. The information must consist of repeated observations or understandings built and maintained over time and shared or passed down through generations while maintaining continuous formats. So if it was a star story, but now we're not telling it as a star story, we're trying to package it in a different context, they won't take it. The practices for ensuring quality control and validation must be appropriate to the nature of the source information. And all of this must jive with, be consistent with evidence-based policy-making plans, which are generally required under like the Information Quality Act or the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB's information quality guidelines. When it comes to safe drinking water, if anything has to do with drinking water, which almost everything in the Everglades does, it must conform to essentially being on parity with the most influential scientific assessments. And so there's this laundry list of stuff that you kind of have to take the ITech and squeeze it into these like square pegs into round holes to try to make it legally usable in federal decision making. This is honestly, I think, a very problematic thing because on the agencies, but agencies never themselves these days with tribal knowledge in those ways, because back in the day they used to be like way too appropriative what these guidelines are supposed to fix. So now you have these federal agencies that are kind of scared to engage, aren't quite sure how to do it. And so on Miccosukie's end, the way that the tribal government has tried to start addressing this is rather than leaving it to the agencies to ask for that indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, instead packaging it, checking all these really frustrating boxes up front, putting, in the footnotes of the letters we're sending out exactly how we want the information to be used, how is it gathered, who are, the knowledge keepers, making clear because we can't produce ITech for federal rulemaking unless it's like the consensus of the tribe. So how do we do that? How do we, bring together all these pieces? And luckily, the Miccosukee tribe, distinct from a lot of other tribal nations, I don't think you can expect this from most tribal nations, just happen to have something called the Everglades Advisory Committee, on which Reverend Houston, Miss Betty, and two tribal elders sit. And that is a committee formed of folks from different age ranges, from different clans, which does produce as close as a consensus uh, opinion of the tribal government. And then that information gets collected. Our scientific team will ask any questions, make any clarifications, so we can do that weaving of Western knowledge in with that indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. Then our business council reviews it, asks any further questions, and the council, who's also composed of tribal members and some tribal elders, is going to take a look and make sure that's consistent with their understanding as well. And finally, chairman will promulgate that letter, that statement of indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, append his signature to it, providing consent for its use in these federal rulemakings. And we have to make sure there's really like zero confidential information in it. We know that's going public. So frankly, the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge we've promulgated thus far is a lot of what you've heard from Miss Betty. It's there used to be a lot more animals. The water used to be a lot lower. And those are kind of the main points that the tribe has been hammering home with ITech. But we have to do it in these like long footnoted letters with like an extensive verification process for Western entities to even accept that information as valid for their use. So in some, yes, ITech recently, Biden administration 2021, is now useful in federal rulemaking. However, there are about 100 pages of guidance that you have to squeeze that ITech through in order to get it fully towards the point that it's usable for federal rulemaking.
Thank you, Mr. Ornstein, for that. That's been a really awesome insight into how the tribe is working with this process. And the tribe must be noted as a leader in terms of Everglades restoration or Everglades healing work. You got to remember that it was the tribe who set the standard for the restoration process back in the day of improving the water quality such that phosphorus is measured at 10 parts per million or 10 parts per billion. And so again, the tribe is a leader in this work, and it's because of the collaborative work that the tribe has been doing. But I wanted to pose a question to Mr. Kniff and get your insight in this process, because Mr. Kniff has been really leading the conversation, helping to lead the conversation when we're talking about shifting baselines when it comes to Everglades restoration. And so I wanted to ask you, Mr. Kniff, what you've seen in terms of how you work with the types of knowledges that you do work with, the scientific knowledge as well as the traditional knowledge, and how that is informing perhaps the policy conversation or the way that the tribe sets their targets or their goals moving forward. I wanted to get your insight on that, Mr. Kniff.
Well, thank you, Reverend Houston. Appreciate that question, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here participating in this important panel. Reverend Houston, you're asking kind of the question that comes to the crux of what, if any, progress we're going to make here in Everglades restoration by utilizing tribal knowledge, tribal ecological knowledge, having the ability for tribes to have voices and to exercise their opportunities to affect and direct restoration targets that are based on a baseline of information for which we are judging whether or not we can meet those targets and whether we're making good impacts, negative impacts, or neutral impacts, and ultimately to achieve the good outcomes that are set forward, again, in good faith, through comprehensive Everglades restoration planning. And so in my role here, working in South Florida for the last 25 years, and I've had the opportunity to work in different manners across different aspects of the Everglades system. And I've been able to serve both tribes here and to come full circle to kind of understand where those perspectives of how to utilize information, how to first even conceive of the information that is required, the important questions that need to be answered in order that we can move forward to make progress and achieve good outcomes when it comes to restoration. And now from Miccosukee to achieve healing of the landscape and allow that landscape to provide for the ecological services that we all intend to have as part of restoration. I've been full circle here, I feel. And it has not been an easy trip, and it is still not a straight line point to point of how to connect these dots, of how to incorporate Indigenous tribal ecological knowledge and synthesize that with Western science. There is perhaps no better studied ecosystem here worldwide over the last 30 plus years than the Florida Everglades. There have been literally hundreds, I'd actually dare to say thousands, if you include all of the students and all the principal investigators from academia, from agencies, from the tribes, who have descended upon the Everglades for the purpose of trying to understand it in order to better restore it. And having been part of that process, it was, I guess, something that I didn't necessarily question starting off even as a student and then in my early professional career, where, of course, we were looking toward the last 30 years of time as being kind of our lens by which we judge the Everglades through. The time by which history has been able to be documented, in particular here, the time in which Everglades science has really come to mature. And comprehensive Everglades restoration planning in its currently 68 different active projects and many more to come are taking a baseline for a system that was already impacted, a system that included the widespread decompartmentalization and channelization and drainage of the system by way of the canals and levees throughout the system as part of the Central and South Florida project, and other earlier efforts to drain the Everglades before CNSF, and obviously includes the two main dams across the entirety of the state running east-west by way of I-75 and the Tamiami Trail, with the latter perhaps being the most influential to date on being a barrier to Everglades restoration and quite frankly, for helping to set what I think Mikosuke is intending to suggest within the broader landscape that we participate amongst the different fora and the different groups of scientists and policymakers, that in Everglades that includes Tamiami Trail and the inability to have a free-flowing system that is still compartmentalized is not the baseline for which to judge Everglades restoration. That we need to look further from these structures and from these changes in the landscape that are man-made. We need to look beyond that in order to set a baseline for which we could more accurately judge how our efforts toward restoration can ultimately be assessed and judged in terms of positive, negative, or neutral outcomes. I found that that has been a difficult notion for a lot of folks to kind of grapple with, and I can certainly understand why. Everglades restoration is not about trying to return it to a pre-drainage system. And we have 13+ million people who live in South Florida, and we have over 1 million people who come to visit the area on an annual basis. And those people need to live somewhere. Those people need to have drinking water. Those people need to farm. Those people need to have businesses, and ultimately that means we need to have flood control. We need to have water supply. But in order to have the water supply and have all of the needs that we seek to have, we need to have a healthy functioning system. And a functioning system that up till now has been able to meet the changing landscape of how sea level has been rising since our last interglacial ice age maximum, and for which has now been accelerated due to the way that human beings over the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution has changed, quite frankly, the atmosphere and has started a process that is going to continue even if we cut our fossil fuel emissions to zero for the coming decades, if not the next 100 to 200 years. And so Everglades restoration is not about, again, trying to go back into the past and establish the past. It is about trying to chart forward a future by which we can use our past understanding that comes from, in particular, indigenous tribal ecological knowledge to understand how our future decisions that we make now are going to come to fruition in 50, 75, 100 years from now. And that baseline that we are judging Everglades restoration off of, by the way, which did not consider sea level rise to begin with, is a flawed baseline, is a baseline that we are not setting off to achieve success from, again, in my opinion, and that we still have time to pivot on and to obviously utilize the incredible amount of knowledge that has been gained and is currently being envisioned by Western science, but utilizing the indigenous knowledge in a way that is not being viewed as anecdotal or pie in the sky, or maybe an interesting story from one or a couple of tribal members, but a bona fide knowledge source by which Western science can actually utilize to enhance the collective work that we are all seeking to do here and the outcomes that we are all collectively seeking to achieve. And so I'm going to hold there. I hope I've made the point here that it is the tribe that is actually in the position to offer this, because there isn't an established knowledge base outside of tribal ecological knowledge that can do this.
Thank you, Mr. Kniff. And I wanted to touch on that idea a little bit more in terms of some of the challenges that the community might be facing in terms of, okay, here we are with an opportunity that's here now to influence rulemaking in the American context. There's an opening now for indigenous traditional ecological knowledge to be considered when talking about conservation work and caring for the earth. There's an opening now for this kind of knowledge. But are there still any challenges with bringing this knowledge forward? Maybe that's a community question. Are you still experiencing any pushback when you're trying to share a perspective on the Everglades or a way of life versus state or federal officials? Is there still any conflict there? And how are you working through that conflict to make progress?
I'm going to attempt to answer that, if that's okay, Houston. Recently, even though the number of years that I fell into trying to advocate for the voiceless, for the plants and the animals, recently in the past couple of weeks, it was commented that I'm not a true conservationist or a true environmentalist. I don't even know whose definition of conservation or environmentalism that is being followed. But so I had to explain that I'm coming from a place of being an indigenous person and of the Miccosukee descent, and that how I view the landscape and understand the landscape is different than theirs. So, and I tell people, I'm not an environmentalist or a conservationist. That's not the title. That's a title. Those are labels that I'm being the indigenous person that I was raised to be, which is to advocate for the voiceless and come from a place of healing, but also coming from a community that views the environment as we are a part of it, and also understanding our existence is dependent on the environment, whether it's to be able to drink that water, to raise our crops, to even harvest fish and other wildlife off that landscape. And my goal has always been that I want future generations of Miccosukees to be able to not worry about when they catch that fish, is it full of mercury? When they catch that, or if it's going to be full of worms. When they catch that, go harvest a deer during ceremonial time, because we do still practice our ceremonies. And we harvest wildlife to take to those ceremonies, a part of our meals, also in certain aspects of ceremonies, using certain animals. And we still do that. And I think that's a very hard concept for people and other parts of society. They don't know that. That's not their upbringing. So they don't understand, why should we go get that fushhatki, that white bird? It's protected. You don't need to do that anymore. You got casino money, so you don't need to do your spiritual practices anymore. You don't need to live off the land anymore. We got Publix and Winn-Dixie. And I think, but that's actually trampling on a tribe's right to practice its culture and its traditions. And a lot of part of my educating is to remind people we're an indigenous people, we're a tribe. Our connection to the landscape is much different than another person's connection, and asking them to respect that the fact that we want to be able to plant our corn on the tree islands, leading up to ceremony. And because the corn we use is the corn that we grow, and trying to explain to them, like currently our islands are flooded. They shouldn't be flooded at this time of year. And we're going on 3 months of flooding. And any scientist out there that studies tree island, habitats understand the significance of what is happening on that island when it's been underwater for 3 months. And we're going to continue to lose tree islands because we keep doing that every year. And they don't understand that those tree islands are somebody's home because they don't live like we do. They don't understand why, I choose to live in an Indian village in a thatched roof structure, because that's how I was raised and was told not to get away from that. So it's still very difficult in educating people that Miccosukee people are different than them. And that's okay, because the mainstream there's still that train of thought that we need to assimilate to their culture and look at the Everglades through their lens. And, so unfortunately, even in 2024, we're still fighting assimilation and getting them to respect, our relationship to the environment is the hardest part. And our knowledge as to why we want that healthy landscape to continue our traditions. And because we are the land and the land is us. And it's very hard to get that point across, because unfortunately there's that view set that in Western society that everyone needs to use the lens that they're seeing through. And so the biggest education is getting them to respect that there's other viewpoints from other cultures, and we need to come, we need to come together to work together to see, because we all want the same thing. We just have disagreements on how we're going to get there. But to realize we all want the same thing, and to take that understanding, because, as Indigenous people, we're taught that we always learn. And our systems of clans, we always learn from each other. And we have to work together as clans to come to a common consensus. And that's the biggest hardship I have. And those of you of the public, I'm going to be blunt about this. Your definition of true conservation is not everybody's definition. Your definition of true environmentalist is not everybody's definition. And you have to recognize that our definitions of things are different. Our understanding of things are different. And you can't label the Miccosukee people as not true conservationists and not true environmentalists. I'm going to be prejudiced and say, I think we are, as Indigenous people, true to the intent of wanting to heal the landscape so that the landscape, the ecosystems thrive, so that we, the Miccosukee people, can thrive to still be here. And to me, that's what is true about it. Your true intent for the landscape and the ecosystem to thrive. So I'll stop there, and maybe Secretary Osceola has some thoughts.
Okay, sorry, I was just replying to somebody who had a question in the chat. They were actually asking if traditional ecological knowledge is being acknowledged in policy making. So I was just replying that it's starting to be more so now than in the past, and that's honestly a lot of the work that the people you see here in the chat and others who aren't here in the chat have done, collaborating, communicating, and the work that the leaders in the past have done, but it's still not to the degree that it should be. And I think it's almost because, they had their head buried in the sand, so to speak, and now they can't do that anymore. I mean, especially when you look up north, you've always had really stringent water quality standards, and we've maintained that for decades, trying to get it back to the standards that nature had set. And I think now that they've had to deal with the algae blooms and things like that up north in more recent years, are they realizing yeah, okay, the tribe was right to have those higher quality standards. But it takes a lot of work to even let them allow you into the room, even though we've been here before the room was even there. But I just wanted to mention that because I was answering that question in there. But what was the specific topic that you would like me to address?
Yeah, I was just curious to see about your insight, because we're talking about that there's a federal opening these days for traditional ecological knowledge. But is there still any kind of pushback that you're receiving from sharing this kind of knowledge? Is it being respected or argued at various levels, maybe local or state or even federal? So what's the conflict? What's the pushback, and how do you work through that?
Well, I mean, just, one of the first conflicts, you can speak to this, Houston, Betty, as well. When you tell people you're Native, they're like, oh, well, I'm Native too. And it's like, but you're not even realizing the perspective we're trying to communicate to you. Like, we are native of this land. You are a native citizen of America. Those are two different concepts. So people right away get on the defensive side. And, they think you're trying to undercut their humanity in some way when you're not. You're just trying to protect nature so that they have a humanity in the future. So that often leads to them undercutting us. And I often see this out there as people trying to devalue the very concept of being indigenous, basically making the argument that nobody is indigenous. That to me, that's just a massive oversimplification. You know, all cultures in the world are shaped by the land that they are brought up in, that they are built on. And I mean, like I was just saying before, we've seen what the standards were before all of this encroachment, development, and everything like that. We've seen what works. We want to go back to what works. And I think specifically with our tribe, the fact that we've had scientists doing great work for the tribe for decades now, year after year after year, being consistent, taking water quality samples from the Everglades and up north by I-75. We have all that data to back up everything that we've always been saying because of what we've experienced from our existence out here. So those are the things that are helping us being taken more seriously out there, but it is still an uphill battle at times. I mean, a couple of years ago, I believe Miss Betty was there as well. We went up to some lands up north to meet with some government people and some other stakeholders. And I was talking to a state legislature and I was telling them like about the water quality and the water quantity standards and everything that's going on out here and all the work that we've been doing for decades. And they made this statement, and it was a very genuine statement. They weren't, it was a big eye opener, but they said, oh, so everything the agriculture people are telling me isn't true. And it was just a nice reminder that ignorance is not always malicious. Sometimes people just have not had that information, that perspective put in front of them. And people are more willing to listen and receive it than you would expect. But it's always key to find those who are in a similar situation than you, as you are, because they're going to be the ones more willing to listen because they realize things aren't right. Things do need to be fixed. Things do need to change. Who are those around us that are trying to affect change? And again, thank you guys for having us because I feel like these are like-minded folks in this conversation, folks who do want to affect change in the world. So the fact that you folks are here receiving this indigenous knowledge, to me, that's a good indicator. Hopefully you can pass the word on so that way there's more validity out there when other people come across it.
Thank you to the Secretary Popeye. That's awesome. And one of the goals for today's webinar is to have an intergenerational conversation. And so we're hearing from folks of all ages on our panel, but we also have folks of all ages listening in on the webinar. So as we open it up for Q&A, we have some amazing questions coming in. And one of them is from somebody that is 5 years old and watching this webinar right now. So this young person, 5 years old, they want to know, what can I do to help heal the earth? This is open to everybody.
You can talk to the earth. Let the earth know that you see the earth. Have that honest I do all the time. I talk to the earth all the time. Whether it's to the mother or the children, whether they're the trees or the air, is to not acknowledge that you see them, that and feel. You know, wherever you live, or if you go to a park or to the beach, just take your shoes off. Like, you know, I was always barefoot when I was a kid. And just, even if it's a matter of just sitting there on the ground, you know, put your feet in your hands and sit there and just talk to the earth. And create that bond with the earth, because the earth will acknowledge you back. And you're 5 years old, but you're very powerful. Just let your feelings of love flow into the earth and just tell the earth how much you love her. And then feel the earth return your love back. And as you grow older, you keep doing that. Talk to the earth, and the earth, when it feels that in your heart you really care, it'll start talking to you and tell you how you can help it. And sometimes the biggest way you can help is just to acknowledge our Mother Earth itself, or the animals. And then from there, because you need to have a future. Because we, you know, I'm 57 years old. I've had, you know, my childhood, my time to make history. And you need your time, even at 5 years old, you need to have your time to grow up to make your history, to live your story, because we all are living our stories. And at 5 years old, even at, whether it's a part of school, even at 5 years old, if there's public meetings that is going to hurt your area, as a 5-year-old, and tell those adults your concerns, because even at 5 years old, your voice is very important, and never forget that.
If I could add to that, I know Miss Betty and I both spent time working at pre-K, and I'm sure she can relate, but the work I did in pre-K changed my life, and that was directly because of the kids I was working with, 3, 4, 5-year-olds. So you guys have the power to change people's lives in ways you don't even think, because I know that changed my whole direction in life after I started working with those kids. And in our culture, kids, it's like they're closer to the source, they're more pure in a way. So there's a lot of value in listening to how they receive the world and their experiences. And that love that you express, it is very powerful. I know sometimes, I don't want to get all, whatever, but that's critical. Your connection to life, that experience, that gives us life. And I'm speaking as, I'm only 35, but even as a 35-year-old, I've been through a lot, but it's the younger ones that keep me going. I'm still young, but there's younger ones, nieces, nephews, other kids. And it's just like, want to make sure that they can have as much access to this environment around them, because that is their future. So as a 5-year-old, you have a lot more power than you would think. And just expressing your love for life and connection to nature around you, just doing that with your friends and family, it's going to have a big impact. When I worked with kids, I told them, there's stuff that we go over, things that connect with you, and you want to kind of see the idea grow, talk to your family about it. They love you. They might listen to you if that's something that you agree with. So just keep that in mind. Even as a 5-year-old, you have a lot more power than you would realize. And sometimes you're going to see things with clarity that adults don't. We get mired in all of these different things that complicate our decision-making process. You don't have to deal with that type of stuff. So your perspective is very valuable in that way.
I'll quickly add, if it's okay, because I think this is a great question. When I was 5 years old, I was looking at bird books and field guides and books on fish. That's what I was interested in. That led me to the curiosity of the earth, and to understand and to want to understand how it works. And that fueled my lifelong desire to love the earth and to try and understand it. And so whether you live in a natural landscape like the Everglades, or whether you live in a city setting, you can still get outside. You can still smell the flowers. You can still watch birds. You can still listen for the sounds. Get out into the world. It will help you to love it. And if you love it, you'll want to learn about it, and you'll want to protect it. And that will fuel your desire as you grow and get older and acquire more knowledge to express that love and to be able to do good in the world. So good for you.
Awesome. Thank you, friends. And I'm going to check in with some folks that are asking again, how can they help? But they're looking at things from a regional perspective. And so we have some people that are living in Southwest Florida and Central Florida, and they're really concerned about the development that is pushing into sensitive ecosystems, ecosystems like the Everglades ecosystems or Pine Rocklands. And they're also concerned these days because of the increasing climate concerns. We had the recent hurricanes. And so some folks are really interested in climate or disaster resilient design. They want to leverage technology for sustainable urban planning that respects the environment. So folks with very unique talents in places across the greater Everglades want to know how they can support or get involved or collaborate further, especially with regards to development or using tech or design to find solutions. Do you all have any suggestions or thoughts on that matter?
Really quickly, you got to stay involved with your local governments. You guys have more power than you realize. A lot of people don't go to meetings, so it's just a few people that end up there. And having worked with local governments, it is true what people say. There is a lot of like backhand deals and things like that. So you have to hold people in power to some oversight. transparency is of the utmost importance. So make sure you go to these meetings, make sure your voices are heard. You look at Miami, there's so much development going around and everybody talks about it. Everybody kind of knows what the issues are, but people don't hold their government accountable like they should. So really, you got to make sure you hold your government accountable. I mean, here at the tribe, they have no problem doing that. I keep referring to Miss Betty, but that's because she does a lot of stuff. She can tell you firsthand, holding people in power accountable is of the utmost importance because it has to be the will of the people guiding the direction that the people are going. It can't just be a few people out there making a few bucks so that way they can keep doing construction that never improves anything. So go to your meetings, make sure your voices are heard, and communicate, collaborate. That's what I would say.
I'll add to that a little bit. I usually say politicians want to do the right thing, but we as the public have to help them do the right thing, which is expressing our concerns, asking those questions, and in your advocacy. And you have to show up, and you have to document. Whether it's making a phone call to state and local and even federal officials, getting your yes, it's tedious, and yes, it's very time consuming, but let them know that you're expressing your concerns. And I've learned a lot from social media that if you put your message out there, whether it's a short video and it gets shared, and I'm going to kind of answer a question that someone else posed: how does environmental activism has it shaped policy or opinion? Trying to answer this question is that using social media and going viral with it last year and expressing concerns over our water depths got the attention of news stations, and news stations started doing reporting and coming out to the tribe and interviewing tribal scientists and tribal members, going out and into airboats, filming what we're talking about, which got the state agencies to open some gates down here to listen to the tribe. Because before then, those agencies were state and federal were trying to trail the tribe. Oh, we're going to look at it within X amount of days. Well, X amount of days wasn't soon enough. We needed something done now. And the fact that using social media, different people of the tribe, not just myself, showing what was going on out here and getting the interest of these news stations, because news stations like drama, right? And getting these news stations out here and helping amplify the tribe's voice got these state and federal agencies, making a quick turnaround to do something out here. So that activism and the methods that you use, whether it's phone calls, whether it's letter writings, whether it's doing these short videos and using that platform to amplify your voice, because people want to help around the world, not just in the United States. They want to help, and they're always asked, when they see what you're doing, they start also amplifying your voice and expressing their concerns. And the more voices that express those concerns about an issue spurs these local and state officials that, okay, somebody's watching. People, there's how many thousands or people or millions of people who are now seeing this. We better do something. So now on the building and the perspective, I always say, when you look at indigenous structures, whether it's Miccosukee or other tribes, how they historically lived, is that we didn't fight the landscape. We built our structures to be in harmony with the landscape. And then I remember years ago on a prayer walk, we stopped in by an Indian village at where one of my late aunts lived. And we stopped next to a prior Indian village where some of my family members used to live, but for about 20 or 30 years, that landscape went back to nature. And we knew where this camp used to exist. It was right near the Tamiami Trail. But everyone else in this prayer walk that was with us, they were just we asked them, can what do you see? And they told us the plants and the trees, and they did not see that there used to be an Indian village there, a development there. And what she was explaining is that when indigenous people, the way they historically built their structures, once they left the camp, over time, that structure went back to the earth, that you could never tell that somebody lived there. And that's the way it's supposed to be, is that your structure over time should, if you're no longer there, should go back to the landscape and become a part of that landscape again. And she was pointing out that the way development is done today is that even if an area is abandoned 20, 30, 50 years from now, you can still tell somebody, those structures are still there, whether it's concrete or steel structures, it's paved over, it remains. You can tell someone inhabited that landscape. But the indigenous people, where they used to live, if you didn't know that they had lived there, you would never know that they had lived there unless you're excavating and taking samples or whatever. But on the surface, their structures return to the environment. So when you're designing structures and developments, it should be in harmony with the environment where you're building. Not today where you're going over and paving over everything with asphalt, and the way you're building your houses. When you look at the Chiki Hut, I always give an example. When a hurricane passes by, the news is always filming that Chiki Hut on the beach that is still standing, but yet all these other more reinforced structures are decimated. That's because that Chiki Hut allows airflow. It was built to be in harmony with the elements around it. And, I'm not an engineer or a contractor or in building or whatever, but, people tend to build structures where they reinforce it. That doesn't work with the wind, doesn't work with the environment. That's why we have all these drainage issues. And we have to start thinking about how are our structures and the way we live, how are they in harmony with the environment? And if you look back to other cultures and their structures, you may be able to adapt your structures or how you build the areas where you live in a better way. I don't know if there's some thoughts on that or not.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Betty. As we move forward, we're going to zoom in a little bit more on some specific things. But before we get to the next question, I just want to say, Betty, that there was one time that you were that we were all in a meeting together with different government officials, and you spoke about how even how we think about our homes, or the concept of home, is something that we have to be very conscious of when talking about these with other communities, because they might think of it as whatever is within these four walls. But you told us and you reminded us that our concept of home is about the village and the broader clan system that we have to consider too. So you constantly remind us to redefine or expand our definitions and things like that. So thank you very much, Betty. Everything that you have to share is awesome and very insightful. So we have some time for a few more questions, and I think that we're going to zoom in on some very specific issues before zooming out to broader concerns again and then wrapping up. But as we zoom into very specific questions that our audience has, they're concerned about like Everglades matters, right? Because we're here to give voice to the Everglades, give voice to the voiceless. And so the greater Everglades covers such a large area. And so folks want to know, are there any specific areas or current planned restoration efforts that are priorities for the tribe? And are these restoration or healing efforts related to animals or water quality? So they really want to know about what are the eco concerns or the Everglades concerns that are very specific and very urgent for the community right now. And if you all have any advice on how to move forward on that.
let me tackle it first, and then I think from a scientific perspective, Mr. Kniff can go into more detail. Right now, the Everglades are drowning. They have been for 3 months. And so our tree islands are always in our minds. And, you know, tree islands provide a home for the plants and the animal communities that are important to the greater Everglades ecosystem. And we keep losing those islands, 70% loss. Yet, the things that are creating or exacerbating the loss of those islands continues. So we need to get people to, more people to understand that we can't keep going down that same path and expect islands to flourish. And a long range goal that that I understand, you know, to work towards trying to help heal those islands is to get policy change and get other entities to realize that the water depths that they want to flow through this area is not ideal for the area that this landscape that we're in. And, you know, from what I understand in the Everglades, a lot of the wildlife, the deer, bear, and other wildlife populations are essentially extirpated here in the Central Everglades. Think about that. They're extirpated. And that's very sad to me when I think about it. And so reconnecting these landscapes and letting this water flow. People probably will wonder, okay, why we have Everglades restoration, why isn't the water flowing? Well, we have roadbeds that we have to think about that are going to be undermined if we try to let more water out in some of the systems and to remove those impediments. And it's very imperative that, you know, we can't keep killing the Everglades, because that's what we're doing. We're continuing to kill the Everglades because we're not really understanding this environment. And we need to start understanding this environment better and figuring out how we're going to help this environment. And because, you know, we can't, you know, some people think, oh, well, you don't need to have bear in the Everglades. You don't need to have panther. You don't need to have the wading birds. You don't need to have the deer. We need to have all those things. Just like bees are very important to help pollinate. You got to have bees. If you don't have any bees anymore, you know, the world is in serious trouble. So all these other animals play their part in helping this ecosystem thrive. And what is, you know, really urgent right now is to help get this water out of here, but also help, you know, because our tribe wants to bring back these animals that are extirpated. But we can't do that if the state and federal agencies keep flooding the landscapes, because these animals are not going to thrive. And we just can't bring these animals back. The tribe is trying to help heal those islands with the plants, trying to look at the soil chemistry, you know, trying to be a doctor to the island, right? Figure out what's hurting that island and then give it the medicine it needs with the nutrients and the other plant lives that it needs for it to thrive. And then to have that food source so that then we can bring those plants and those animals back. And so it's a long process and trying to get it right. They always say the water quality and the timing right. And that's very imperative. In addition to trying to keep Miami-Dade County from building that incinerator next to the Everglades. Because if anything's going to help hurt the environment more, is all those toxic chemicals from that proposed incinerator that the wind patterns flows towards the west over the Everglades. So we need to make sure that incinerator does not get built at the edge of the Everglades. And we also need to make sure that those toxic radioactive chemicals that they want to use from the, when they make fertilizer, the phosphorus for the fertilizer, the toxic chemicals that are radioactive, the state of Florida is now pursuing putting those radioactive materials in roads to resurface roads. So if anything is going to hurt, another thing that's going to hurt the Everglades is that radioactive material from those gypsum stacks that they want to use in roads. So I'm going to leave it there, and Mr. Kniff can go from the science side of because he's in the weeds with so many different things about the Everglades, and has a broader perspective probably than I do on what needs to get done.
Well, thanks, Miss Betty, and you've certainly covered a lot of the things that I would have noted here. The Miccosukee tribe is trying to push forward a policy that speaks to the holistic nature in which the tribe expects that Everglades restoration should be addressing its various component projects to, again, achieve an outcome of a system that can be flowing from the headwaters in the Kissimmee River chain of lakes down through Lake Okeechobee and down through the central Everglades down to the coastal estuaries and bays. The elegant solution to Everglades restoration, simply stated, is to remove the impediments and barriers to flow south. That's the elegant solution, but it is not the easy solution. We have people who have built on the Everglades. We've developed and filled in approximately 50% of the Everglades. It has not stopped raining 50% less than it had historically. And so Everglades restoration is every bit an exercise in plumbing, in how to deal with water, in how to send the water through the system in the ecologically relevant timing, and of the water quality that Ms. Betty is speaking to here, and in a quantity that is appropriate to achieve the life history needs of all of the component species within the system. And that the Everglades itself is a variable system. A lot of restoration and current management strategies are really directed in trying to put forward some static notion of what an Everglades hydrologic cycle should look like from wet season to dry season every year. And a lot of that is also dictated by trying to meet the needs of particular species and or to set timing of when water gets moved or gets held back in order to try and manipulate certain habitats. All of this ultimately, though, results in what we see today is a continued degradation of the system holistically from top to bottom. The solution here that the Miccosukee tribe is also offering as part of its knowledge of how the system has evolved and changed over the millennia that it has been taking shape, and for which the Miccosukee tribe has been very much shaping the system, is that variability year to year is every bit as important as the water is in terms of where it is in place and time. When we get years where it rains a lot, we're going to see water in the system. And in years where it doesn't rain as much, we're going to see dry out and drought and dryness. The issue is that the water should and has to be able to flow when it is put on the landscape by rainfall, and not to determine the timing as much by way of water management. The system can do much better on its own, and the animals and the plants take their cues from the system conditions that are natural cycles as opposed to man-made cycles trying to impose what our understanding of what those cycles might be. These are concepts that are still difficult for the interagency group that has to deal with how to go about with water control planning within the system. A little less on the engineering, a lot less on the engineering, a lot more on the reopening of the system, a lot more ability to allow for the variability. This is the simple, elegant solution of putting the water back through the system and allowing it to flow in the way that Mother Nature should determine based on how much it rains in a particular year. the excess, quote unquote, excess water from the 50% less space that the water can be able to be attenuated and to move across the system, that is a challenge. That is a challenge. And that is part and parcel of a lot of the restoration projects that are finding ways to put the water into places that doesn't provide for continued flooding in the central Everglades. And I could go on and on for hours about this. I'm going to hold it there. If the takeaway solution here for folks who are listening and for which the tribe is trying to be the advocate for is to remove the barriers to flow in the system, allow for that water to flow in the timing that is determined by rainfall, and to give it the ability to be variable. If we can do those things, the tribe has the knowledge to show that the system will be resilient and can be robust and can heal itself in that respect.
That was masterful, Mr. Kniff. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question that is very timely and that illustrates the relationship of traditional ecological knowledge, the community with the land. And the question is concerning the wilderness or a proposed wilderness designation for the Big Cypress National Preserve. The folks here want to know, how would that impact the Miccosukee way of life and the environment?
I'll answer that first, if that's okay, because I'm going to be directly impacted by a designation if it were to go forward. I live in what is now is called the Big Cypress National Preserve in my family's Indian village where I grew up. When the Big Cypress National Preserve was created, in that enabling legislation that Congress passed, in that enabling legislation, in the language of it, Congress specifically put in verbiage that the Miccosukees and Seminoles, their rights to subsist, to occupation and use of that landscape would continue. So they protected our way of life to continue into the preserve, to live there, to hunt there, to fish there, to farm there, to do our spiritual, our ceremonies there. They protected that right when they created the preserve. This proposed wilderness designation in the area where they want to have the wilderness. Remember, wilderness is landscape that is untrammeled by man. So basically I thought, okay, I guess Miccosukees aren't people. They're not mankind, because we live there. And I think some well-meaning group of people trying to help the environment didn't understand that you have Miccosukees and Indians out there. And I don't want to think they did it maliciously. I just think they didn't understand the landscape and how it's used. And so where I live, where I lay down at night to go to sleep, is right in that designated area. So I personally, if that designation goes forward, even though Congress protected my right to be there, my family to be there, to have that Indian village there, that designation would remove us, would remove my Indian village from where we historically lived. Our green corn dance ceremonies are in that proposed designated area. The Miccosukee tribe and Seminole tribal people would no longer be able to have their ceremonies in that area. We would have to pick up and move. We wouldn't be able to, because they're miles from the road. And historically when water flowed, you could, pull your dugout canoe there. If it was dry enough, you're going to walk all the way there. And a lot of times some of the camps were closer to those areas. But here, because of the change, because you got the Tamiami Trail, now we use vehicles to traverse those miles to get to those ceremonial grounds and to maintain those ceremonial grounds. So the Miccosukee people would be divested from that landscape. Basically, it would be another taking of access or taking of land from the Miccosukee people, which Congress currently protected. And it would be undoing the intent of Congress. And that's what we're trying to educate, because people say, oh, well, we need to designate it to stop oil drilling. The Miccosukee tribe for a number of years now has been working towards having those mineral rights purchased by the federal government. And that's, we're almost across the finish line in doing that. So we don't need this designation to stop oil drilling, because the tribe is aggressively and very actively has been working on that. And we're almost there. And we need people, people need to understand that the Miccosukee and Seminole people, we're still out here. We're, in order to have conservation of a landscape, you have to be a part of that landscape and understand what is going on in real time. And there's a lot of invasive species out there, plant and animal. And if you just close it off, those invasive species are going to continue to thrive and take over that landscape. And unfortunately, it takes mankind to go in there and help to manage those landscapes, to remove those invasive species, whether they're plant or animal. It's going to take mankind's interaction to help that landscape heal, because it's not, we're not at a, if you wanted to have, wilderness was when no one lived on this landscape. And even before the Miccosukee, there were other indigenous people here that trammeled that landscape, that had interactions with that landscape. And unfortunately, I think it's a lot of educating that needs to continue to get individuals to understand that, we're out here. We're a part of this landscape. If anything, we need to move towards co-management of the Big Cypress National Preserve with the Miccosukee tribe, because we have the knowledge and understanding to help that landscape thrive. And it's at a point where it needs our help to get it back to thriving. You don't need to remove the indigenous people, which is what that wilderness designation would do.
Simply stated, the Wilderness Act of 1964 has intention to try and enhance land preservation across the United States has had a terrible legacy of excluding and dispossessing native lands. And in this case would exactly be an example of this here. It would be a dispossession, again, of native lands from the Miccosukee tribe, and ultimately lead to a further erosion of culture. And the notion of wilderness in 2024 is just not, it cannot be supportive of a notion that people cannot and do not exist within natural landscapes. So we're working to continue to ensure that this doesn't occur within the Big Cypress.
All right, just checking in if the secretary has any comments that he wants to make, or
Yeah, actually, speaking about wilderness, it's unfortunately, it's just been the name of the game since the foundation of this country, just trying to undercut the humanity and the existence of the indigenous people of this land. I had to deal with this when I was working at the school, but when the kids at our school would learn about the Declaration of Independence, that foundational text to this country's very existence refers to all of us natives as merciless Indian savages. And that was one of their reasons for stating that they wanted to become their own people so that they could fight back against the savages of this land, which would be us, our ancestors. And even back then, the concept of wilderness, that's where it all started from. These are savages. How could they ever work this land? How could they ever understand it? How could they ever have a place here? And then you look at what that led to with Manifest Destiny, and this whole concept of this land was put forth for us to propagate, to go forth and prosper, to weed out the darkness. And again, who was included in that? That was us. So unfortunately, it's still about displacement and undercutting our existence, which is what wilderness does in effect. And it doesn't give us a place because it says we've never had a place. And I think about my grandmother, Peggy, who I mentioned earlier. She was almost 100. She was born in the swamps. Somebody like that who has that strength and is still around because of their connection to nature and how uncomplicated that is. You're trying to throw more bureaucracy just so somebody can continue existing. It's just fundamentally at odds with us as humans in our nature, which is, again, to be connected with nature. I just wanted to get that out
there. That was excellent, Mr. Osceola, and I want to say thank you to my colleagues here today. Thank you to Secretary William Osceola, Ms. Betty Osceola, Mr. Kevin Kniff, Mr. Edward Ornstein. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And as we wrap up, I just wanted to point out that there are quite a lot of people here today on the webinar that do want to help, that have brought up questions about curricula, about educational programs, about insight on advocacy, community building, very specific things, very broad things, but the community is interested in collaborating. So for those that want to follow up, I do recommend staying in touch with FIU, and they'll put you in contact with the community here at the Miccosukee tribe. But it has been a very awesome conversation to talk about these important matters, to listen to the voices of the Everglades. And I think that for me, I would just like to extend an invitation to everybody here to come on out, to get to know the land, to fall in love with the place, as Mr. Kevin Kniff and others have so eloquently reminded us today. And it has been my honor to serve as your moderator, and I look forward to seeing you all again somewhere deep in the greater Everglades. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Houston, do you mind if I add one last thing?
Please do.
If you want to stay connected, please feel free to reach out to us. Houston, Betty, and myself, we all have Instagram accounts, and we often post about the work the tribe is doing. The tribe also has an Instagram account. We have our Arts and Crafts Festival coming up in December from the 26th to the 29th, I believe. That's our 50th anniversary. And that was set up to get people to come out here to experience the Everglades and learn about our culture and the work that we're doing. So please come out and visit, attend that. That's a multi-day event. Also, I believe still on Saturdays on ABC local channels, you have to check your listing. They're doing reruns of Wildlife Nation with Jeff Corwin, which was a TV show that we filmed to show the work that we're doing out here in the Everglades to preserve it, as well as spotlighting some other people within the state who are doing the good work as well. And if that's something you enjoy, you get to catch an episode, please let us know, because that's actually something we may engage with again, but we need to see how the public feels about it, because it is about public engagement, getting them to understand. So we are doing a lot more outreach, and other tribes are also leveraging social media to get connected with those who want to get connected. So please look us up. There's multiple ways to experience what there is out here and to learn more about us.
I want to thank everyone once again for attending this event today. Just illustrated to us that we need to have more of them. We need to engage in more dialogue and more conversations. So we look forward to having you at our future events, and we look forward to you attending these numerous events that the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida is engaging in. Reach out. They're very collaborative. They're very supportive, and the knowledge is there for you if you're willing to listen. Last but not least, I want to also bring out another opportunity for you to engage in this knowledge from our community experts that are just simply as important to everybody else. The Commons for Justice have a symposium coming up, and you'll be able to hear from a number of these parties again, and that's going to be on November 12th, 2024, and that's going to be from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We look forward to seeing you there. If you want any further information, check out our webpage. Don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we look forward to seeing you, and we look forward to you being change makers, working together collaboratively. Especially for me, coming from the Gullah culture, coming from the space of the environment and the land, we appreciate this conversation, and we raise up the voices in this space. Many blessings on each of you. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the attendance from all of the attendees. Thank you.
Thank you.